Hey, this is Jen Cotton, pronouns she, her. Welcome to FLYTcast Off the Cuff. So, it's going to be a short one today. We'll see, I tend to go on, but I've been thinking a lot lately about George Orwell's 1984. And shortly after I left the cult I grew up in, I came across this book, and I never read it in high school, but I found a copy on Audible, and I'd always been curious, so I gave it a listen. And it blew my mind how much George Orwell understood about psychological control. And especially, over the previous year or two, a year and a half or so since I had left the cult at the time, as I was learning about cult tactics, this man really got it. He understood. I don't think that uh, he knew Lifton's criteria as such because they were published after he left. After he left life, after he died. That's kind of like a weird way to describe it. Let me double check. I'm gonna check on the internet as I often do since these things are off the cuff. But I believe George Orwell died in 1950, and I'm going to look up Lifton's criteria for thought control. Uh, Thought control and the doing with one hand here since I'm recording on my phone. Psychology of totalism. That is the sound of a Google search. All right, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism by Robert J. Lifton, publication date 1961, first edition. So this was published 10 years and some change after George Orwell's death. And there wasn't a lot of uh, clear understanding of thought control in the West. Of course, these are principles that tend to emerge uh, just as a result of human instinct. And people have been trying to control each other for centuries, but the science of it had really been um, systematized and developed more in the East, particularly in Stalinist Russia and Maoist China. And Lifton had done his research in victims of the Maoist China regime, particularly after the Korean War, and he came up with a lot of the same conclusions that Orwell did in 1984. In a future episode, very soon, we're going to be talking about Lifton's 8 criteria. But suffice it to say, you can find every single one of them in 1984. And I got to wondering, okay, how did Orwell understand these things? What, did he experience in his life to allow him to independently isolate these principles of what can break down the human mind to be malleable and moldable and controllable, to an extremely broad and simultaneously granular degree. Everything about the human mind can be controlled through these mechanisms, and it's a tragedy. And his book is a tragedy and is a warning. Now, I'd heard it referenced in the public discourse, and I was like, excuse me, everybody likes to claim Orwell. The left claims him, the right is particularly fond of claiming him, saying, oh, he was speaking against socialism. Turns out that's not true. He was speaking against totalitarianism, whether on the left or the right, specifically, Stalinism and fascism. And INGSOC has, well, a lot of resemblance to Stalinism, but his criticisms came over the course of a really fascinating life. Uh, these thoughts that he had, developed from being, there's this phrase in the book, if you imagine the future of humanity, it's the heel of a jackboot stomping on a human face over and over again. He was that jackboot for a while. I read this biography because I was wondering how did he how did he come to understand these things? He was the jackboot for a while because after his education in kind of a posh prep school, he decided that he wanted to follow his family. Apologize for my throat. I say that a lot, but his family's past because he came from kind of a line of police officers, and he decided to go become a police officer in India during the British occupation. And he was a captain or some higher rank, and he became appalled at how people under him and himself uh, became desensitized to violence, came to see the people that they were supposed to protect and serve. Uh, they perceived them as lesser than, as subhuman. They felt justified and felt very little, if any, guilt at abusing them in every way, physically, emotionally. Uh, you know, Officers would kill them with very little regard, and he wrote about some of that in some of his essays. So he experienced being a jackboot and didn't like what he was becoming, and he left that situation. I believe he was also ill as well, and spent some time back home in England. And then he wanted to understand what the underclass felt like, what it was to be, as described in 1984, a prole. And he came from a relatively well-off family, not the most wealthy, but enough again that he could get a good education at the time. But he went and became kind of an undercover journalist for a little while. He went to France and lived basically as a homeless person, working odd jobs, doing dishes and different things, and understanding what it was like to live with very little, and what the people were like there, and getting to know them, and figuring out what daily life was like, having to struggle for material needs, understanding what it was like to be under the jackboot, or at least as close as he could approximate to, the people that he felt so guilty for abusing in India. And he did that for a while, and he wrote about that. And then, he started to develop strong political views about taking care of people, taking care of their needs, and didn't feel like the government was doing enough. Like that, there was much more that could be done, but the wealth and power was being funneled upward, and people beneath were being left to languish and with very little control over their lives. And he and his wife, he was married by this time, heard about the Spanish Civil War between the fascists and the anarchists in Catalonia. Catalonia wanted to be its own country, and he felt passionate enough about this because he didn't want to be a jackboot, and he saw the plight of the underclass, and he wanted now to go fight for their liberation. And he went down to Catalonia, the anarchist society down there. Now, contrary to popular belief, anarchism is not lawlessness. That's more like extreme libertarianism at the very bottom right of the political spectrum. Anarchism is the bottom left of the political spectrum, which is lots of personal freedom and taking care of each other. So socialism without authoritarianism is kind of the basic idea. And he was very impressed by what he saw down there, impressed by their government that lasted for a little while. And they were battling with Francisco Franco, and this was on the ramp up to World War II. It hadn't happened yet, but Hitler came in and decided to do kind of a test run on his blooming military, that he was preparing to use to take over the rest of Europe. And he's like, hey, I'm fascist, you're fascist, let me back you guys, and you guys can test out some of our toys. And the Nazis came in support of the Spanish fascist troops and started battling with their resources against Catalonia, and it became unbalanced. But then the Soviets saw this, and they were were not anarchist left, they were authoritarian left, but they felt kind of a kinship and they wanted to support them. And so Stalin sent people to support Catalonia and the anarchists. But George Orwell watched again as people became jackboots, as, just as he'd seen on the right, because, the British were very right-wing, in India, how, people were being abused there, he saw a different sort of totalism, a different sort of authoritarianism leak in and corrupt the anarchist government in Catalonia. Stalin sent resources, but he also sent propaganda and worked to indoctrinate people in Catalonia towards a more authoritarian bent. And it was really pretty awful. George Orwell watched this indoctrination. He watched people start to exhibit all of, Lifton's 8 criteria of cult control, and saw the group drift into paranoia and making enemies of each other, of a demand for ideological purity in the group and punishment of anybody who was different. It got scarier and scarier, and he got more and more uncomfortable with the situation, with the Stalinism that was creeping into the anarchism. And, it's difficult to say whether he would have left or not with, this communist infiltration, but he ended up getting injured. He was shot through the neck, shot through the throat, and it was a grievous injury. He survived it, but it was a bad enough injury that he ended up having to go back home to England to convalesce. And it was a grievous enough injury that when World War II came around, he wasn't allowed to enlist, even though, he had that spirit of wanting to fight for what he felt was right. He wasn't allowed to enlist because of his injuries. And so he became heavily involved on the home front, preparing people for invasion with their, community groups that the civilians would organize at the time. And he and his wife also became involved in the media. George Orwell worked for the BBC, and his wife worked for the, British Ministry of Information or equivalent. I apologize. Wow. So, both of them during the war, we consider the British to be on the right side of the war, but both of them were disturbed by how controlled the expression of the media was, how any sort of criticism of the methodology and whatnot was suppressed, how things that they were true they had to hide and even had to tell lies sometimes. And both of them felt very uncomfortable with this. Now, the ethics of this during a war can be argued, but they realized how much the government could control the media to control what the people were thinking. As we've talked about in this FLYTcast off the cuff podcast before, information control is one of the most massive and important forms of thought control, because if you control, just like a computer, you control what goes into the computer, then you can control what can come out. If you don't give people the language to speak dissent, then they can't think dissent. They can't grasp their minds upon concepts they don't have language for. And so, based on these frightening experiences he had in India, in France, in Catalonia, and in Britain during World War II, along with some of the positive things that he experienced in Catalonia, witnessing, the anarchist government, he came up with his 2 greatest works, which happened right at the end of his life, 1984 and Animal Farm, both of which spoke against totalitarianism. Animal Farm spoke a little bit more about Stalinism. But contrary to popular belief, he was a leftist. Again, everybody tries to appropriate Orwell and say everybody else is brainwashing. We're the only right ones. But he was against not brainwashing on the right or the left. He was against totalism more generally. He himself was a leftist. He considered himself much closer to Trotsky than to Lenin or Stalin, but he would have landed fairly close to where Bernie Sanders is today. He was a social democrat. That's not to say that his exact views were correct, but that's where he's at. That was where he was coming from. So I didn't intend to go into his whole backstory today. Like I say, when I start talking, I tend to talk. But the thought that occurred to me today that I wanted to kind of get down and express was something that happens in 1984, if you've read the book or seen any of the movies, etc., etc. Listen to one of the 50s radio shows that happened as well. Something happens to the main character, Winston and Julia, his secret lover. They decide to join the resistance partway through the book. And spoilers, you can turn this off and find out for yourself if you don't want to find out now. I think you've had enough time now. So when they join the resistance, they're given all this information, given a book that explains something closer to the true history of the world and how the government is controlling them and all these awful things that the government is doing. They're given this book, and they read it, and just as they're really beginning to wake up, that's when the secret police bust in and capture them and torture them and try to break their minds down again. Turns out, though, that the guy who gave them the book was actually a government agent. It was the government, the political cult that had given them all this information that was against the group. And something that kind of bothered me recently as I've reflected on 1984, because I'm thinking of doing some projects based on it, both as an artistic project and to as a vehicle for cult literacy. I wondered why the government would give them all this information that they didn't want them to know before. Why they would give them all this information that spoke against the government, that spoke of the atrocities and the way that they were controlling people. Why would they tell Winston and Julia what was actually happening in the world? If they wanted them to fall in line. It seemed like a step back before going, 2 steps forward. And this bothered me for a while, but then I realized that's what many cults do when they start to, when their members start to have doubts. In the group that I grew up with, some people just kind of took things at face value and didn't think too much deeply about the doctrine, but participated. Mine was a religious rather than a political cult. But the people that were curious enough and cerebral enough to start doubting and realizing that some of the things didn't make sense, there grew this kind of movement of apologetics, this cottage industry of justifying what the group was saying, when it didn't make sense. It became kind of a way to keep smart people in. There's a myth that you have to be stupid to get duped into joining a cult. This is not true by a long shot. In fact, smart people are some of the most valuable assets to a cult, because the initial doctrines and the initial mental cage built by the cult is going to have some holes, is going to be escapable. But if you get a smart person who's really dedicated and really believes that it's true, and they start to find holes, before escaping, they're going to try to justify it. They're going to think about their doubts and figure out, some kind of solution, even if it's not true, and it's usually not true, these mental gymnastics to justify everything that the cult is doing, whatever the abuses are. And these solutions get very creative. I was one such person. I would encounter these struggles I had with the doctrines and those things of the group, and I would come up with all sorts of justifications of how these atrocities or whatever they were, or these inconsistencies or these lies, how the lies were actually true, how the atrocities were actually signs of the truth or of the love of the group, and it's something that was, part of God's understanding that wasn't part of man's understanding, that sort of thing. When you start to doubt, if you can figure out a way to assuage those doubts, even if it's, through mental gymnastics, even if it's not completely, even if it's not true, if it's enough to assuage those doubts, then you've built a stronger cage for yourself. And not only that, if you communicate to others when you hear their doubts, then you build a stronger cage for them. So it becomes sort of an inoculation against the truth. In my former group, there are websites, there are books, there are seminars. People even make a living off of, apologetics for the group. Apologetics being defending a philosophy. It's kind of, well, let me put it this way. It's the opposite of the scientific method. The scientific method is you make a hypothesis and you try to disprove your hypothesis, and it's believed to be true insofar as it can't be disproven, but you continually challenge your own knowledge and try to go to the next thing. Improve your knowledge. You're happy when your hypothesis is disproved because you've reached the next level of knowledge. Apologetics is the exact opposite, and it happens in religion. That's the context you hear about it most often in. It happens in politics. It's the inverse. Rather than trying to disprove your own idea to refine it, you try to prove your idea and make justifications for it. You try to think, okay, how could this be true, rather than is it true? You're not truly open to letting things go that you start out from the outset with believing. The purpose is to make the thing look true, even if it's not. That's not how people think of it, because they're like it is true. And so working from the assumption that these doctrines or these lies are true, working from the assumption that they're true, how could that be? And it takes a lot of imagination and a lot of intelligence to create a convincing illusion around that. Again, when I did this, I was completely bought in. I completely believed it. The people become kind of the processing power of the computer that develops the mental cage. You are assets to kind of the hive mind. It's kind of like another brief tangent. The Matrix, another dystopian future story. The way that the movies, turned out, the people who were stuck in the Matrix were the energy source for the computers, the batteries, right? If you know that story. But in the original script, before kind of the studios modified it, because they didn't think that people would get it, originally the Wachowski sisters wanted the people that were trapped in the Matrix to have their brains used as processing power, as computer processing power for the machines. So the people themselves were the machine. The people's minds were being used to maintain the situation, which you get a similar concept with the batteries, but it's not as profound. But the studios thought that the human brains being used as the machine, as the processing unit, they thought that was a little bit too complicated and abstract for audiences, and so they reduced it to the batteries. But it's very true. That's how cults work. So back to it. 1984. Why would INGSOC, why would this controlling government give Winston and Julia so much of the truth before kind of beating it out of them? I think it's kind of a similar thing. It's this idea of inoculation, of this idea of if you start to have doubts and then have a satisfactory explanation for yourself, or have them beaten out of you, or whatever method. Sometimes people will have a logical circumvention to the doubt, some driven by emotion, but sometimes it'll be purely emotional. You'll have thought-stopping cliches, things like, I don't understand this right now, but I trust that this is true and God will explain it to me in the eternities. And sometimes that's as far as it goes. But I think that something Orwell understood was that if you can understand some of the truth, have some doubt, and then end up going back on it and returning to belief, then your belief becomes even deeper and stronger and more difficult to reverse. And I think that's why Winston and Julia were given this information before going into the prison camp and room 101 and the torture and what have you. I think that makes a lot more sense. So, these principles, both Orwell and Lifton, and the more recent cult researchers and psychologists understood. Orwell had a particular interest in language. Obviously, he was a writer. His passion was for that craft. And there was a lot of time spent in the book on the idea, what Lifton would call loading the language. And I'm going to read that definition here. Loading the language, one of Lifton's 8 criteria. We talk about this a lot. We talk about Lifton a lot. I love Lifton. We need to do an actual episode or video on the 8 criteria, so that's out there. But he says that the loading the language is the group interprets or uses words and phrases in new ways, so that often the outside world does not understand. This jargon consists of thought-terminating cliches which serve to alter the members' thought processes to conform to the group's way of thinking. So, there's the classic slogan that you would see in 1984 on all the posters. There's Big Brother is watching, of course, and then there is, hopefully I don't botch this, slavery is freedom, war is peace. These, that's an example of loading the language. This idea that you can make words mean something that they didn't mean before. So this idea, something that a lot of cults do is they'll take these positive words and they will invert the meaning so that you still think, for instance, this idea of freedom. Freedom, we might have a definition outside of cults and say freedom is the ability to, exercise your own agency, to chart your own path, to follow your own heart, to do the things that you feel you want to do. That's freedom. Whereas in 1984 and in many cults, they say slavery is freedom. In 1984, they say that pretty explicitly, but other cults will loop around it a little bit. In my particular group, I was taught that freedom meant freedom to do the right thing, meant freedom to obey. Freedom, that you lost freedom when you disobeyed, and you gained freedom when you obeyed. And that you would have the most freedom when you were obeying the most, because that was God's way. And that's this idea of freedom is slavery. They invert these things. That's an example of loading the language. You can also, load a bunch of assumptions into a single word. For instance, in the cult of, Jehovah's Witnesses, they call their teachings the truth. They don't say, the teachings of the church or the teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses. They say the truth. And so in order to speak about the teachings within the organization, you have to reemphasize to yourself over and over again, this is the truth, this is the truth, this is the truth. And you believe it more and more just by referring to it. Language is the architecture of thought. That's something that the researcher Noam Chomsky, one of the most prominent linguistics and political minds of the 20th century, uh, uh, hypothesizes this idea that language didn't start out as an idea, as something for communication, but something that was the architecture within our own brains that we hang thoughts upon. When we think, we're using we're using boxes in our brains in order to categorize ideas, and it's kind of like the operating system of a computer. And if you can mess with that operating system and take out the ability to perform certain functions, then the computer can't perform those functions. That's what happens with the loading of the language. If you and that's something that Orwell uh, was very explicit about in 1984. He talked about getting rid of words and of compressing the language and loading more and more meaning into smaller and smaller words so that they were more difficult to separate apart and think about. So when you spoke, you had to, uh, even just to think and speak at all, you had to affirm the teachings of the group. Again, this idea, you refer to the teachings in, the cult of Jehovah's Witnesses, you refer to it as the truth. Um, War is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. So we'll leave you with those things. Again, this, kind of spontaneous episode comes after, just wondering, why would they tell them the truth as a part of indoctrinating them? And, kind of spun out into talking a little bit more about the history of George Orwell and why he believed what he believed and what he got. Again, I was so impressed when I read that the first time after studying cults for a little while. It's like, wow, he really got it, even before these models came out, even before the system, the science of it began to be understood in the West. He really got it. I highly recommend 1984. Watch this space. I will probably post some of my artwork and further thoughts about 1984. I'm thinking of maybe making a comic or a short film or some short stories. Maybe even getting some other people involved. Have, maybe people write a compilation of short stories, because 1984 recently went into the public domain. So that's an exciting opportunity to, explore that world for anybody who's interested. Whether, if you want to, reach out to me, and, if you're a writer or an artist and you want to participate in that with me, or if you want to do it on your own. Either way, I'd be very interested to see what you come up with. As always, wishing happiness and freedom to you and yours. Spread the message, get cult literate, and help other people understand what these principles of manipulation are, so that they can be free themselves, so that they can know for sure that they're making their own decisions for themselves and not being programmed, like we see described so clearly in 1984 or in Lifton's 8 criteria. Love to you all.